Hello, reading room. It is Dr. Annette Feravich. We are here on day 239. It is August 28th, and we are on chapter 11 in our book, A Different Mirror for Young People, A History of Multicultural America. Let's go ahead and start reading chapter 11. Jews from Russia began their immigration to the United States in the 1880s. This is Jews are pushed from Russia. Now, I just have to say that from our reading room, we know, not reading room, from our last class, our Bookless classroom, we know that that would be Japheth's area there. Is what we're talking about, that red area there. All right? I know. Jews from Russia began their immigration to the United States in the 1880s. Like many other groups, they were pushed into immigrating by unbearable conditions. But unlike the Chinese and Japanese workers who had at first planned to be temporary workers in America, the Russian Jews came as permanent settlers. They knew there would be no going back. Persecution in the Old World. Jews were a persecuted minority in Russia. In an important sense, those who fled to the United States were political refugees because the Russian government itself encouraged acts of violence against the Jews by the Gentiles or non-Jews. Repression was everywhere. Jews were confined to a special area called the Pale of Settlement in Western Russia. Now, also, this coincides with the Pale Horse of Revelation. The law prevented them from owning land, forcing most of them to live in urban areas, towns, or villages called shuttles. They earned their livings as merchants and craftspeople. In 1879, almost 40% of the Jews worked in manufacturing or crafts. This created economic hardships for them, as an immigrant explained. It was not easy to live with such bitter competition as the congestion of the population made inevitable. There were 10 times as many stores as there should have been, 10 times as many tailors, cobblers, barbers, tinsmiths. A Gentile, if he failed in Politz, could go elsewhere where there was less competition. A Jew could make the circle of the Pale only to find the same conditions as at home. That is the explanation from a Jewish immigrant. Okay? It was not easy to live with such bitter competition as the congestion of the population made inevitable. There were 10 times as many stores as there should have been, 10 times as many tailors, cobblers, barbers, tinsmiths. A Gentile, if he failed in Politz, could go elsewhere where there was less competition. A Jew could make the circle of the Pale only to find the same conditions as at home. Life in the shuttles was intensely insecure. Anti-Semitic violence or violence aimed at Jews was a constant reality. Most dreaded were the pogroms, bouts of persecution in which Jews were massacred and their shops and synagogues, temples destroyed. I feel that every cobblestone in Russia is filled with Jewish blood, an immigrant bitterly recalled. Absolutely every year there was a pogrom before Pesach, Passover. I wanted to try and say it right. I'm not sure if I did. In big cities during the pogroms, they used any reason to get rid of you. As many Jews as they could kill, they did. But there were some Gentiles who would save you. The pogroms made Jews in Russia and Eastern Europe realize that they had to leave. Many of them looked west to America. Dreams of the New World. By the time World War I began in 1914, a third of all Jews in Russia and Eastern Europe had emigrated. Most went to the United States. We are talking about, in the Bookless classroom, who these Russian Jews are. A little bit. I just discovered, because as you can see, they're not just Russian Jews. Russian Jews, I have to look at it, but may have made it into the yellow area, which is the Mesopotamian descendants of Noah, is what we're talking about. Who migrated where from Noah's time? And then, of course, Abraham's time, because Noah was before Abraham. And then, of course, from Adam and Eve themselves, of this people, Semitic people. I am getting a cold, so I'm going to sneeze in a minute. Is that how it sounds when you say it in Jewish? That would be Hebrew. Shtels. I think that's closer. Life in the Shtels was intensely insecure. I read all that. Okay. Dreams of the New World. By the time World War I began in 1914, a third of all the Jews in Russia and Eastern Europe had emigrated. Most went to the United States. So some of these, you have to think about it in terms of Jews and non-Jews, right? From the Eastern area, which would be Samaritans. It sounds like it could be Nephilim. What? Oh my gosh. That's what we're talking about in the Bookless classroom. I can't help it. These things coincide. How could I possibly think that that would coincide with this book? Nephilim. In the old country, the air around them had been full of stories about the freedom and better life they could have in the United States. People read letters from America aloud in shops, markets, and synagogues. Children played games pretending they were emigrating. America stirred people's hope and dreams of a promised land. Fears of persecution, together with grand visions of a new life, gave the Jews the courage to uproot themselves and leave their birthplace forever. On the streets of the shtetl, women sold their beds, chairs, kitchen tables, and other belongings to raise money for the passage to America. Taking only their personal possessions, the Jews left the familiar little towns of cobbled streets and crowded marketplaces. Like many other emigrants over the centuries, one man realized only at the moment of departure how long his journey would be. This was the point at which I was cutting myself off from my past, from those I loved. He later recalled, would I ever see them again? He later recalled, would I ever see them again? Hold on. You don't need to hear this. You know what I miss? A box of Kleenex that was stuffed to the hilt. I do. Honest to gosh, of good Kleenex. Honest to gosh, I miss that. Doggone it, I'm not recording. When they boarded ships to cross the Atlantic Ocean, the voyagers were herded into crowded compartments below deck, often dark and dirty. Some immigrants traveled on cattle carriers that had been turned into passenger boats. As often as possible, the passengers went up on deck to breathe fresh air. They sang Russian folk songs and shared stories. Now, see, also when you think about this, right, I have this mental image of my husband coming over from a story, right? A mental image from a story of my husband coming over as a pig. Now, why would they do that? Because they couldn't afford to bring, and he was the size of, and that was likely free, and thinking they would see he was not, right? How problematic. From the very beginning, you're forced to treat your child like an animal in order to get them to the promised land. Which was probably a perversion of their Bible knowledge, Torah knowledge. Finally, after a long crossing, the passengers sighted land. My husband's family was from Lithuania. It seemed that conditions were very much the same. My dad, we paid for a trip for him to Mexico. He went to Puerto Vallarta. I don't know if things were the same. It's hard to say with the cartel. I don't know that he was involved with the cartel. I'm just saying it's hard to say whether or not he was able to change that, right? I don't know. I don't know that much about it. I do have a book on Mexican barrios. I need to look at that. Excuse me, sorry about that. That is, yeah. That I think is me taking the parasites out of the environment, something like that. I don't even know. What would I know? I don't know. Finally, after a long crossing, the passengers sighted land. It was a moment of high emotion. Everybody was on deck, said Emma Goldman, who was 17 years old when she arrived from Russia. My sister Helena and I stood pressed to each other, enraptured by the sight of the harbor and the Statue of Liberty suddenly emerging from the mist. Ah, there she was, the symbol of hope, of freedom, of opportunity. Of Paramount Pictures. Who were these newcomers searching for a door to America? In general, they were educated. 80% of the men and 63% of the women who came between 1908 and 1912 could read and write. Most were poor, but 2/3 of them were skilled workers, such as craftspeople. And unlike most other European immigrants, they planned to stay. 60% of the southern Italian migrants returned to their homeland. For Jews, in comparison, the rate of return was only 3%. Another difference was that the Jews immigrated as families. Almost half of them were women, compared to about 20% for southern Italians, and a quarter of them were children. They had come to America, their new home. Again, this whole thing of persecution all the way through the history of the Jews. There's a lamplighter talk I do. It was only 2 of my episodes, probably in my spiritual, I'm quite sure, in my spiritual classroom. If you want to look up lamplighter, there's a great article on that it can't be the Jews. It has to be God who is making an example of them. And that is what people find to be really almost horrific, bordering on horrific. A shtetl in America. From the immigration station on Ellis Island in New York Harbor, most of the immigrants headed for New York City's Lower East Side. That being a horror for the Jews is probably not a universal thought, though. During the early 19th century, German Jews had settled in this neighborhood, New York City's Lower East Side. As massive waves of Russian Jews began arriving in the 1880s, a new Jewish community blossomed there. By 1905, 500,000 Jews lived in the Lower East Side. Unlike nearby Chinatown, with its high population of single men, the Jewish colony had throngs of children. In this community, Jews seemed to live the same way they had in Russia. They dwelled and worked within a small area, meeting only people like themselves. Oh, I'm sorry. Yet, life moved at a faster pace with more emphasis on business, bustle, and making money than in the old country. The atmosphere was one of energy and ambition. Sounds like they're building Solomon's Temple. The Jewish neighborhood was also a ghetto, crowded, stifling, and often unsanitary. Residents were packed into 6 or 7-story tenement buildings. A typical apartment held not just family members, but friends and boarders too. A survey of 250 Lower East Side families in 1908 found that half of them slept in rooms with 2 or 3 other people, or even more. Many individuals slept on cots or on the floor. Now, as a poor person, you could see nothing wrong with that. Not only that, that would engender a closeness. just by mere proximity, and you would be talking and awake at the same time and sleeping at the same time and having similar experiences. So yeah, 3 or 4 kids in a bedroom. That's what we called it. Some of them on cots. I'm just saying that's what we call it today, no matter who you are, right? Okay. So also, this is a narrative, right? I probably took it out of there, didn't I? Ugh, hold on. That's a narrative that they're putting together because, and it's a terrible one, because they're equating family life to creating a ghetto situation. Here is the first time I'm seeing the word ghetto as an association. The Jewish neighborhood was also a ghetto, crowding, stifling, and unsanitary. They don't, those are the unsanitary conditions have to do with the sanitation department, right? It's going to become unsanitary really fast if my toilet doesn't work, if there's no plumbing, if there's no place for me to go to the bathroom. Now, that might not bother Nephilim. They may be able to store up their poop like they store up their sleep. It's possible. And the conditions, so the conditions that they're describing here, a typical apartment held not just family members, but friends and boarders too. 2 or 3 people or even more to a room. Some slept on cots or on the floor. It probably depended, right? If you were above, you could sleep on the floor. If it was a dirt floor, you wouldn't, right? You would sleep on a cot. Makes sense to me. I think my husband's father was from New York, or had lived in New York, I'm pretty sure. As they settled in the Lower East Side, the Jews established organizations and created a community of services. Landsman shafts were networks or lodges of people from the same town or district in Russia. Bathhouses, delicatessens, cafes, movie theaters, and synagogues met the immigrants' needs. In the streets, peddlers sold goods such as buttons, bananas, matches, apples, and clothing from carts. The majority of working Jews, however, were employed in the garment industry. Now you could see here, how did they get these? It was a collective effort. And then people knew that you were able to get them at this stand. So you can definitely see where this is the roots of capitalism. But it is also teaching you something, that it's in community, that it's in this family living that this works. And breaking up the tribes isn't going to promote the kind of, and of course, if there's Nephilim that want to go to sleep and need a flood to do that, well, you can see there's a dilemma. This picture here is a Lower East Side tenement in New York City, 1912. And there's nothing wrong with this. I mean, you could say that if you looked other than, right, whatever, that was Jackie Gleason's apartment. A lot less furniture, right? A lot less furniture, but about that size. So that's not bad. I remember living in apartment buildings that had rooms that size, and other rooms then were the bedrooms. Those were called apartments. Tenements, apartments. Some had 2 and 3 in a room. I don't know who's spinning this. And for what reason, other than to suppress, again, the Jews. Why? Because they're fertile, they come from the Fertile Crescent. An army of garment workers. All right, hold on one second here, because I have to get something out of my nose. An army of garment workers. Jewish success in America depended on more than energy. The Jewish immigrants brought useful skills, especially in sewing trades. Their arrival was timely because they were needed in New York City's growing garment industry. In earlier times, individual pieces of clothing had been tailor-made and measured to fit the buyer, but the Civil War had changed that. To meet the Union Army's demand for clothing, tailors had established standard sizes and measurements. This let them mass produce clothing in factories using new inventions such as the sewing machine and the buttonhole machine. The number of garment factories increased rapidly, and the center of this new industry was New York City. By 1910, nearly half the city's factories and industrial workers were producing clothing. At first, German Jews had dominated the garment industry. Then the Russian newcomers entered the business, and together they produced good quality machine-made clothing that could be sold at moderate prices. The Lower East Side became an industrial beehive, block after block of small, busy workplaces called sweatshops, humming with the sound of thousands of sewing machines. Most sweatshops were small, with fewer than 30 workers. Although some were much larger, they were usually run by contractors who rented the space and equipment and who sold the finished garments to larger manufacturers and distributors. Now, no matter what is going on, there is no way that we can be now trying to think that it's a good idea to separate, to separate. People make their own choices. We said that. Don't tread on me, right? People can make their own choices. And there, again, what I see right there was family living is what I see. I see poor family living and making the best of it. And certainly this does not look untidy at all. And I remember my grandmother's place, and she was from she was from the Ukraine. Spotless. Her place was spotless. We had plastic on the furniture kind of people. Yeah, those were the Eastern Russians. Now it does seem though that you could clearly have a monotheistic belief or a polytheistic belief, right? In these Russian Jews. Right? Interesting. That's the reason why you really do need all the people on board of their own free will. And people seeing it in a certain direction. That monotheism is not monarchy. And that's probably the biggest problem, right? That monotheism is not the same at all as monarchy, because there is a real Almighty God. And I'm not it. I don't claim to be it. I'm not that, and I'm not a monarchist. I'm simply an example, just another example. But we need universality on this example. Yeah, I can buy into that example. Yeah, I can do that. Not so that person owns the shop or the ideology, right? Or your ideology. We're just buying in. Not monotheism. I'm worshiping as well. I worship as well. I am not asking for worship ever. I'm just helping the system. Oh. Where was I? But you are talking about the genesis of sweatshops. Now, by example, again, it's like, okay, well, are you telling me to live by example then? Build sweatshops. You know, I'm sorry to say it, but it all depends on monotheism versus polytheism. Do you like those small g gods that are hanging out here spiritually to play games in the cosmos? I mean, you call them sweatshops, that's a narrative. If you decide then to start hiring people and abusing them and say that the Jews gave us the narrative, well, that's clearly a perversion of what I'm seeing here based on labels. Ghetto, sweatshop. Do you see those labels? self-fulfilling prophecies for what people see when they see, in this example, the Jews. Monotheism, we're all worshiping the same God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who did miracles and gave us everlasting life, not in the same way as the small g gods, but with great moral integrity and great moral fiber. And again, I have no problem letting somebody else be the example. I'm waiting for my family. I'm not the only example. I am not the only example. I don't know who else is. I really don't. But you probably do. And these are the contractors that I'm talking about. Not these Jewish families, but these people who perverted this concept by using words like ghetto and sweatshops. Laborers worked in teams with members given specific tasks, such as cutting cloth, operating sewing machines, making buttonholes, or pressing the garments. The team received a group wage based on the number of garments they produced, with each member getting a percentage based on his or her task. This system drove everyone to work hard because each member wanted to speed up the team's pace of production. Performing the same tasks over and over, skilled tailors and seamstresses felt like slaves. You wouldn't if it was for your own family. It's only in a pure capitalistic rather than a community, right? I'll use the word community. Sweatshop work was physically punishing, hot, noisy, and dangerous. Why? Why was it hot, noisy, and dangerous? When did it become hot, noisy, and dangerous? Because if these small sweatshops with 30 people in it were family, then no, they would not have those conditions for their family. Accidents such as stitching fingers and sewing machines were common. The workday was long, from 11 to 15 hours. This is when the sweatshops became official by non-Jewish standards, is my interpretation. The workday was my work was sewing on buttons, one sweatshop employee said. Now, we're saying sweatshop employee here. We are not saying that this person was Jewish any longer, was a Jewish immigrant. They may have been Russian. Hear what I'm saying? While the morning was still dark, I walked into a dark basement, and darkness met me when I turned out of the basement. Daughters of the colony. Thousands of the garment workers were young women. Many had come. So now these are not just Jewish people. They are people of the garment industry. And this is different as well. Now you are likely getting a mix of Asians and Jews. Thousands of, which reminds me of my Aunt Lily, who was on my husband's side. Thousands of the garment workers were young women. Many had come to the United States on their own before their families because they possessed sewing skills. They could get work, save money, and help the other family members. These young Jewish women made up more than a third of the garment industry's workforce in 1910. In the sweatshops, they were packed together, elbow to elbow, operating sewing machines at rows of long tables so crowded that there was no way to escape in case of emergency. Now, you also get the feeling over here that there may be a little bit of Nephilim going on with the imperialistic mentality of the dynamics between Japanese and Chinese individuals mixing with what they may know and believe to be a spiritual people, Nephilim. These young Jewish women made up more than a third of the garment industry's workforce in 1910. Did I read this? In the sweatshop, they were packed together, elbow to elbow. Yes. Disaster struck. Oh, I was going to say, yeah, whatever. Disaster struck on March 25th, 1911, when a fire suddenly broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. I find that the use of the word triangle there so interesting. We're talking about triangles in the Bookless classroom. What is that? Here comes the Trinity. The irony is it's the four horsemen. 800 workers, mostly young women, were trapped in the burning building, screaming, struggling. They jumped from windows, some from the 9th floor, their bodies smashing onto the sidewalks. Jumping from the higher floors, the girls came down with such force that they tore the nets from the firemen's hands. And this sounds like September 11th as well. This is the exact same description that they gave on September 11th. There were so many dead and injured September 11th, 2001. There were so many dead and injured that they could not all be taken away in ambulances and patrol wagons. Grocers and peddlers offered their carts. Mothers rushed to the scene where they saw their daughters' blackened bodies laid out on sidewalks. News of the horror rapidly spread to the shtetls of Russia, causing a panic. Families feared that their own daughters or granddaughters or cousins were among the dead. One reporter wrote, "I looked upon the dead bodies and I remembered these girls were shirtwaist blouse makers. I remember their great strike of last year in which the same girls had demanded more sanitary conditions and more safety precautions in the shops. Their dead bodies were the answer. The great strike." This also had something to do with also wanting, if I remember the news correctly, sanitary napkins dispensers in the bathrooms. Not at this time, but I think I was surprised, and it had to do with Islamic religion. So many of the Islamic faith were there in the 9/11 building that didn't allow for sanitary napkin dispensers in the bathrooms. Makes sense, doesn't it? Relative to the beliefs. So you had to go to another floor You can see the problem. The Great Strike. The Great Strike that the reporter mentioned had taken place in 1909 to 1910 when workers at 3 factories, including the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, had walked away from their machines and demanded better working conditions. They asked the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGWU, to call for a general strike in the entire shirtwaist industry. But the ILGWU had just been founded and it lacked the resources to organize such a massive strike. The power to do so had to come from the people themselves. The women strikers organized a mass meeting at Cooper Union, a private college on the Lower East Side. And how convenient to have brought in backup workers. We have so many Chinese women immigrants. Thousands of people came to show support for the strikers and to criticize the factory bosses, and also the police who were arresting strikers and the hired thugs who were beating them. Inspired by the meeting the next morning, 15,000 more shirtwaist workers went on strike. The strike eventually involved 20,000 workers, overwhelmingly Jewish. Their demands included a 52-hour work week, overtime pay, and recognition in their union. And I remember this in the 70s as well, to show you how slow things are to be moving. The same thing in Michigan, demanding a 52-hour work week, which quickly went to a 40-hour work week. During the strike, the Lower East Side was a seething mass of excited demonstrators. Whole neighborhoods burst into applause when word came that another boss had settled with the strikers. By February 1910, more than 300 of the 450 or so shirtwaist businesses in New York had been forced to make some kind of settlement. One was the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. Tragically, although the company agreed to most of the strikers' demands, it did not make safety improvements in time to save the lives of those who perished in the fire a year later. The Jewish community was proud of its brave and determined strikers, who were commemorated in a poem called The Uprising of the 20,000. In the black of the winter of 1909, when we froze and bled on the picket line, we showed the world that women could fight, and we rose and we won with women's might. Hail the wastemakers of 1909, making their stand on the picket line, breaking the power of those who reign, pointing the way, smashing the chain. Several months later, after strike erupted when 50,000 cloak and suit workers walked off their jobs. This strike ended with a compromise between strikers and bosses, in which the strikers received some of the benefits they had demanded. These labor struggles were a landmark in Jewish American history. They launched a decade of strikes in the garment trades and a period of union growth. By the end of World War I, 1918, rights labor historian Susan A. Glenn clothing workers were among the best organized members of the American labor force. The garment strikes were a movement for workers' rights, but they were also an ethnic movement. The great majority of strikers were Jewish, and their struggle held the attention of the Jewish community in America. The labor triumph sharpened a shared sense of ethnic identity, and in turn, Jewish Americans took a continuing interest in the labor movement. From greenhorns to Americans, when Jewish immigrants arrived in the United States, they were foreigners in their dress, language, and thinking. They called themselves greenhorns, newcomers who did not yet know their way around. Eager to assimilate into American society, the greenhorns wanted to become modern, to blend in. To blend in, however, they had to give up certain customs. They had to abandon the clothes they had worn in the shtetls, for example, and dress in American style. Hats instead of caps, collars and neckties for men, bright colored shirtwaists and jackets for women instead of brown dresses and shawls. Language was also a mark of assimilation. In Russia, the Jews had spoken their own language, Yiddish. Few of them made any effort to learn the dominant language, Russian. As immigrants in America, though, they were eager to learn English. In a letter to a Jewish newspaper in New York, a mother complained about her daughter. During the few years she was here without us, she became a regular Yankee and forgot how to talk Yiddish. She says it is not nice to talk Yiddish, and I am a greenhorn. And so that was part of the book that I got after I was reading this, Jacob Rice's book, How the Other Half Lives, and also that movie that also started this whole thing, but I can't remember what it was. It was something in the wind or something like that. I can't remember. But where it was showing the tenements, not looking bad at all, and it gave you that sort of Jackie Gleason feel a little bit, right? And also it was from the perspective of a Jewish man who said, forget this, I'm American. I'm proud of being an American. I'm happy I'm an American. Forget this other stuff. The quest to become American had led some Jewish immigrants, perhaps many of them, to change their names. Bachlowitz became Buckley. Stefanski became Stevens. First names changed too. Rivka became Ruth. Moish became Morris. As successful Jews adopted American habits, they celebrated American holidays. To some, exchanging presents at Christmas, which is not a Jewish holiday, was one of the first signs that one was not a greenhorn. Jewish people also began taking vacations, favoring resorts in the Catskill Mountains of New York State. Married women withdrew from the workforce. To have the luxury of not working meant that the wives and their families were economically and socially successful. Ambition and education. As unionized workers and business people, the Jewish immigrants acquired the means to educate their children. They were driven by a determination to have the second generation be professionals rather than laborers or merchants. This determination, however, benefited mostly the sons of the immigrants. Many daughters worked in the sweatshops, contributing their earnings to the family to help pay for their brothers' schooling. In 1910, the income of working daughters amounted to nearly 40% of the average Jewish family's earnings. Meanwhile, young Jewish men were going to the colleges and universities of New York City and other places along the East Coast. And their sisters were probably going, they're the dummies of the family and we know it. Why do they get to go to the universities? By 1960, nearly half of the students at New York's Hunter College and almost 3/4 of those at City College were Jewish. Now remember, these were colleges, and so they were privately funded. If you wanted to have state funding, you became a university. And that, I think, was in the 80s. And so this was another example of other idols, right? Around that time, Jews also began to enter Harvard in Massachusetts, which many consider to be the most elite and prestigious college in the country. A fifth of Harvard's student population was Jewish by 1920. But the increasing presence of Jewish students at Harvard led to a backlash. In 1923, a magazine writer complained that ambitious and upwardly mobile Jewish immigrants sent their children to college a generation or two earlier than other immigrant groups, which meant that there were more dirty Jews, end quote, more dirty Jews and tactless Jews in college than dirty and tactless Italians, Armenians, and Slavics, and end quote. Anti-Semitic grumbles swept across the campus. Some students resented the Jewish students because their grades were so high that they made other students look bad. Abbott Lowell, Michigan, president of Harvard, announced that the college had a Jewish problem. He led efforts to reduce Jewish enrollments. One of his arguments was that keeping the number of Jewish students to a minimum would prevent anti-Semitic feeling on campus. New admission guidelines at Harvard placed emphasis on well-rounded applicants rather than simply on grades and called for more students from areas other than New York City. Applicants were also required to submit photographs because many people believed it was possible to identify Jews even if they had changed their names by their facial features. Not everyone agreed with Lowell's views. Mayor James Curley of Boston, an Irish American, spoke out against discrimination aimed at Jews. All of us under the Constitution are guaranteed equality without regard to race, creed, or color, Curley declared. If the Jews is barred today, the Italian will be tomorrow, then the Spaniard and the Pole, and at some future date, the Irish. A new nativism. The anti-Jewish restrictions at Harvard were part of a later movement of nativism, a way of thinking that favored the established inhabitants of a region of county over newcomers and immigrants, and that placed native-born people's interest ahead of the interests of others, and that's the beginning of eugenics right there. In America. Okay, I want to know who, because they do have references back here, so I'm going to find out who that reference is. That is Fosho. This surge of nativism led to a strict new immigration law of 1924 that Congress passed. The law was designed to reduce immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. It established quotas or limits on the number of people, exactly what they did with the Chinese, with the Japanese, with the Italians, with the Irish. Each quote, I don't know if they did it with the Irish. Did they have? No, because they ended up being white. Each quota was equal to 2% of the total number of people of that nationality who had been in the United States in 1890. In other words, the quota system adopted in 1924 was based on population figures that were already more than 30 years old. Because large-scale Jewish immigrants did not occur until after 1890, the number of Jews in America in 1890 was not great, and the number now permitted to enter the country each year was just 2% of that number. The same held true of other nationalities. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had introduced the idea of limiting immigration by nationality. The law of 1924 applied that principle to many immigrant groups, not just one. So the Chinese would have had a low number as well, is what they're saying. The German Jews who had arrived earlier had been welcomed in the U.S. society. What made the more recent wave of Russian and Eastern European Jews seem threatening to Americans? They were culturally more different from Americans of English, Scottish, and Irish descent than the German Jews had been. They arrived in much bigger numbers, making people fear an invasion of ambitious foreigners who seemed highly successful. In addition, the Russian Jews involved in the labor struggle and their participation in strikes seemed threatening. Now, from a cultural perspective that we were taking a look at in our Bookless classroom, this would probably be the Indo-Europeans. Not Indo-Europeans. The noble ones who were Well, these would have been Ham's descendants. Who then were German Jews. And again, polytheistic green, polytheistic red, monotheistic yellow. It's just shocking to me. Shocking. The more the Jews succeeded, the better they assimilated, the more American nativists disliked them. Hostility sharpened as the Jews began moving out of the Lower East Side, closing the distance between themselves and Gentile America. So that would be the West. When Jews tried to buy homes in more middle-class neighborhoods, they often encountered rules that specified that property could not be sold to Jews. Still, during the 1920s, more than 100,000 Jews left the Lower East Side, spreading into more distant parts of New York City, such as Brooklyn and the Bronx, and beyond. Years earlier, as refugees, Jews had fled the shtetls of Russia to what they saw as the promised land of America. Now they, or their children, were migrating again, embracing the possibility of life in the United States, striving to assimilate and becoming Americans. Courageous Clara Lemlich. Clara Lemlich was a child when she developed a secret reading habit. She was a teenager. Now remember again, these people are very bright. 60% of them were literate when they came to America. She was a teenager when she came to America, and she was only 23 years old when she helped lead the Great Garment Workers' Strike of 1909 to 1910. Lemlich was born in 1886 in Ukraine, which was then part of Russia. Her parents would have sent her to school, but the Russian school did not admit Jews. They forbade her to speak or read Russian, but Clara defied her father's orders, learned to read, and borrowed books whenever she could. She secretly wrote letters for neighbors to pay for her book habit. One neighbor's revolutionary pamphlets convinced her of the need for political and social change. When Lemlich was 17, her family emigrated to America to avoid the pogroms. Those were the massacres of the people, usually Jews. She found work in a garment shop on the Lower East Side. Appalled by conditions in the workplace, she got involved in organizing a union. When the first shirtwaist workers' strikes broke out in 1909, Lemlich was warned by older male union work members who considered her a hot-headed pest, that young women could not carry out a large, long-term general strike. She ignored them. During the historic mass meeting at the Copper Union, while workers and their families shared their grievances, Lemlich rushed to the platform and insisted on speaking. "I am a working girl," she cried out, "one of those striking against intolerable conditions." Then she said, "I am tired of listening to speakers who talk in generalities. What we are here for is to decide whether or not to strike. I offer a resolution that a general strike be declared now." The chairman of the meeting jumped to the platform and joined hands with Lemlich. The two raised their hands high. The crowd pledged to strike, and the next morning 20,000 workers walked off their jobs. After the strike, Lemlich could not get hired at any New York garment shop. Throughout the rest of her life, in addition to becoming a wife and mother, she fought for women's suffrage, socialism, and the rights of consumers and tenants, and later against nuclear weapons. She died at 96 in a Los Angeles nursing home, where she had helped the orderlies organize a labor union of their own. That was chapter 11. On Tuesday, we are back here with chapter 12, Up from Mexico. Thanks so much for joining me here in the classroom this week. We have just completed another week and another day, day 239 in the classroom. It is August 28th. Hopefully, maybe, I've encouraged you to read something about all the wonderful things and interesting things we've been talking about, even Nephilim. I went to Discovery Institute to a course there, right, a colloquium actually, and as a student in one of their summer classes. And the biggest topic there that they wanted to talk about was Nephilim, the students. Thanks so much for joining me here. So we're talking about it here in the classroom, where we really are using topics, even topics like Nephilim, to create a healthier mind, a healthier body, and a healthier spirit. Thanks so much for joining me.